Hello, I'm Jerry Grant, Chief Executive Officer of ACT's Retirement Life Communities. I'm sorry that I'm not able to join you in person today, but I am pleased to join you by video to share a brief message before we begin our Town Hall meeting. Each year at this time, we look forward to presenting to you our annual report, a state of ACTS, if you will, offering an overview of our many achievements over the past year and providing reflections on how we are doing in fulfilling our mission. But most importantly, it's a time to provide you with an update on the financial health of the organization that you have trusted and invested in. As we all know, the coronavirus pandemic continues to impact our world, our nation, and our organization. Early on, our senior leadership team took the position of being decisive in our actions to mitigate and reduce the spread of this new unprecedented virus. As each day passes, there's a clear evidence that our protocols have been successful. And combined with the vaccine administration, we are now well on our way to defeating this pandemic. We are so grateful and appreciative to all of our residents and employees throughout the ACTS family for how you've responded throughout this challenging time. Your actions, patience, and support are truly appreciated and reflective of what makes ACTS the very special and safe place that it is to live and to work. And so it is in this spirit that we continue to respect our safety guidelines and join you today by video to present our 2020 annual report. In a moment, I'll be joined by Christiansen, our president, Jonathan Grant, our Senior Vice President of Community Operations, and Susan Ahern, our Vice President and Controller, who will all provide highlights of the many significant achievements and exciting accomplishments we've experienced over the past year. As we look back on the year 2020, we're extremely proud of all that was accomplished throughout the ACTS organization and our family of communities. Despite the challenges of the pandemic, 2020 brought us much to celebrate. Most notably, our continued operating and financial success. I am so pleased to be able to report to you today the ACTS organization remains healthy and our future looks even brighter. We hope you find this annual report informative, inspiring, and reflective of our dedication to meeting our mission. As our programs and services expand in response to resident aspirations and growing our ministry, we continue our path towards the future, always mindful of our commitment to serve each other in the spirit of loving kindness. Thank you for being a part of the ACTS family. Thank you for all of your support and for the confidence and trust you place in us. May God continue to bless you and the entire ACTS organization.
Thank you, Jerry. Hello, I'm Christiansen, President of ACTS Retirement Life Communities. I do hope you are all doing well, and I thank you for watching this video. It is a pleasure to present you our 2020 Annual Report presentation. This presentation supplements the information in the annual report and provides highlights of the year 2020. Jonathan Grant, Senior Vice President of Community Operations, and Sue Ahern, Vice President and Controller, will join me in reviewing our governance and leadership structure, an overview of the ACTS family of communities, our occupancy and operational highlights from last year, including our pandemic response and workplace excellence. We will end the presentation in reviewing our financial performance for 2020 and the ways we expanded our mission and supported our ministry during the year. ACTS is a not-for-profit organization, and as such, there are no owners. ACTS is governed by a board of directors whose members, other than Jerry Grant, our CEO, serve as volunteers without compensation. At the end of 2020, the board was comprised of 16 individuals with diverse backgrounds and over 200 years of service to ACTS. In addition to their commitment to our mission, they provide extensive experience in areas that are of importance to our business, including healthcare, strategic planning, business operations and management, technology, and finance. 2 past ACTS CEOs continue to serve our organization as a member of the board of directors, including Reverend George Gunn, who is also a resident at Brittany Point Estates. In addition to George, there are 3 other residents who are members of our board, including Ann Louise DeVenny from Fort Washington Estates, Robert Evans from Matthews Glen, and Bruce Detweiler, an existing board member who recently became a resident at Brittany Point Estates. Mr. Bill Reynolds, a beloved resident and board member of both ACTS and the Evergreens, will always be honored and remembered for his faithful service and significant contributions to our organization. He was instrumental in the affiliation of the Evergreens with ACTS in 2018 and was a mentor and dear friend to many, including myself. For the ACTS organization, the year 2020 started with new leadership appointments, including my appointment as president. As the former chief financial officer, I was replaced by Rick Winter, who serves as senior vice president and CFO. With our significant growth in 2017, 2018, and 2019, we strengthened key areas of our business, including human resources, with the addition of Deirdre Gronin, Senior Vice President and Chief Human Resources Officer, Chris Hartman as Vice President of IT Operations, and 2 clinical positions, including Teresa Moore as Vice President, Resident Health Services, and Dr. Paul Reinbold, Vice President and Chief Medical Director. These appointments were unknowingly a significant blessing as we faced a global pandemic a short 2 months later. 4 of the 6 of us in new positions were existing members of Management Council, which is led by Jerry Grant, Chief Executive Officer. Members of Management Council include Executive Vice Presidents and Senior Vice Presidents who provide guidance and supervision for all areas of business within the organization. These include Community Operations, led by Charlie Coxon, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, and Jonathan Grant, Senior Vice President of Community Operations. Glenn Fox leads our legal, compliance, and risk departments, and Jeff Kane serves as Chief Administrative Officer, overseeing human resources, ACTS Corporate University, communications, and administrative functions. Other areas of Senior Vice President level oversight include human resources, real estate services, technology, health and home services, business development, marketing and sales, and finance. Vice Presidents provide additional leadership in the areas of finance, construction services, procurement, technology, sales, dining and nutrition services, mission support and spiritual life, and resident health services. Vice Presidents of Operations provide direct support and direction to our communities, which are grouped together as regions. All members of Management Council are deeply committed to the mission and to the success of ACTS, responding to their personal call to serve through their dedicated and tenured service with ACTS. Collectively, we have served the organization for over 500 years. As part of our response to the COVID-19 challenges, the number of Management Council members is 2 less than last year, reflective of the retirement of 2 members who have not been replaced. The ACTS organization was founded in 1971 through the vision and commitment of a pastor of a church to provide housing and high-quality care for its senior members of the congregation. Our first community opened in 1972 in the backyard of that church in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania, where they both remain today. With the quick success of that first ACTS community, 4 additional communities were built in Pennsylvania that same decade, and the organization also decided to venture out of state and build its first community in Florida, St. Andrews Estates in Boca Raton. In the 1980s, 2 additional communities were built in both Pennsylvania and Florida, and we entered another state with the development of Matthews Glen in Matthews, North Carolina. During the 1990s, the organization adjusted to its rapid growth while adding its 8th community in Pennsylvania and 2nd community in North Carolina. As we entered the 2000s, industry consolidation through affiliations provided a new growth option and strategy. We completed the last community we developed, which is Lanier Village Estates in Gainesville, Georgia. And we completed our first affiliation with an existing community, which is Azalea Trace in Pensacola, Florida. Since that first affiliation in 2003, we have added 11 additional communities through affiliation in the states of South Carolina, Alabama, Delaware, Maryland, and New Jersey. The majority of the communities fall into the legal entity of ACTS Retirement Life Communities, as we do have a history of merging affiliates into ACTS Retirement Life Communities after certain criteria is met. The remaining affiliate communities are listed on the right and include Heron Point in Chestertown, Maryland, Westminster Village in Spanish Fort, Alabama, the Evergreens in Morristown, New Jersey, and Integrace, which includes 3 communities in Maryland, Bailey Chase, Buckingham's Choice, and Fairhaven. Supporting entities are listed on the left and include ACTS Management Services, which provides management, marketing, and development services to all ACTS communities. ACTS Signature Community Services, which includes our home health, hospice, and physician services, and ACTS Legacy Foundation, which supports our philanthropic efforts. Collectively, we are a family of 26 communities with over 7,000 employees serving over 10,000 residents. ACTS remains the 3rd largest not-for-profit senior living organization in the country. Our corporate offices are in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania, again, where our first community was built. We also have 5 regional offices and teams that provide leadership and support to the communities within the specific region. It is now my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Grant, Senior Vice President of Community Operations.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, I'm Jonathan Grant, Senior Vice President, Community Operations. I'm so pleased to participate in this presentation and share with you highlights of 2020. Starting first with our occupancy levels. Across the ACTS family of communities, we have a history of high occupancy levels in independent living. Fortunately, occupancy was not significantly impacted by the pandemic and was almost 93% at the end of 2020. While a slight decrease compared to the prior year, it far exceeds the industry average. According to a recent study from Ziegler, CCRC occupancy levels fell to 85.8% by the end of 2020. When including units committed and selected, occupancy improved to 94% at the end of the year and averaged 95% throughout the year. The slight reduction in overall occupancy in independent living units was due to turnover exceeding the number of move-ins, certainly an expected trend given the suspension of move-ins for an entire quarter. It is notable that turnover only outpaced move-ins by 10%. If you applied a factor of 25%, since sales were suspended for 25% of the year, total move-ins would have trailed turnover by another 100 units. This means that sales made up some of the lost move-ins from the second quarter. As such, the variance compared to the prior year was only a 16% reduction. Again, despite move-ins occurring for only 9 of 12 months during 2020. A positive sign for the future is that the number of prospective residents on the priority list remains consistent with prior year levels at approximately 3,000. Occupancy levels in Oakbridge Terrace and Willowbrook Court decreased in 2020, dropping below 80%. This was quite intentional, as during the pandemic, the focus was on the safety of our residents and not on maximizing occupancy. As such, new admissions into our higher levels of care were limited and in most cases suspended. This strategy helped us to separate residents in semi-private rooms and keep residents in their independent living units as long as possible. With the additional capacity in Willowbrook Court, we strategically reduced our occupancy and payer mix, converting over 300 semi-private rooms to private rooms, increasing the percentage of private rooms across the organization from 53% to 73% in just 1 year. It is a unit mix that we hope to maintain, and the adjustment in our revenue streams was incorporated into the 2021 budget. As our communities were dealing with COVID cases, COVID prevention, new COVID policies and procedures, a changing census and staffing patterns, they also had to deal with state surveys. Our average number of deficiencies increased slightly in 2020 compared to the prior year, partially because Park Point Village in South Carolina and Lanier Village estates in Georgia were not surveyed. More importantly, our average number of deficiencies of 4.8 is well below the national average of 8.1. During 2020, as a result of the pandemic, there were a significant number of infection control surveys. Across all of our communities, we had over 100 infection control surveys in Oak Ridge Terrace and Willowbrook Court. We believe our communities were selected because the surveyors felt comfortable and safe in their communities, limiting their own exposures. Of the surveys, all but 3 were deficiency-free. For the 3 that were not, they resulted in only 1 minor deficiency each. 4 communities also had deficiency-free annual surveys during 2020, a phenomenal achievement. The results of the infections control surveys and annual surveys are a true testament to the competence, dedication, and commitment of our staff. This commitment and dedication to excellence is evident in the 5-star rating from CMS. Remarkably, 20 of our 25 Willowbrook courts are rated a 5-star, and all 25 have either a 4 or 5-star rating, providing for an overall rating of 4.8, significantly above the national average of 3.3. Given our high standards for quality and compliance, we were also the first in the industry to receive the Health Ethics Trust certification for a comprehensive compliance program. The ACTS compliance program has been recertified by the Health Ethics Trust for another 3 years, from 2021. This is the 3rd time that the Health Ethics Trust has certified the ACTS compliance program. Certainly, the year 2020 will forever be remembered as the year of COVID. Our response to what became a pandemic started in early March with the establishment of a clinical task force comprised of members of senior management and corporate leadership, chaired and led by Karen Christiansen, our president. Our success was based on the task force's endless leadership, commitment, determination, and focus. In the most challenging of times, the committee members never wavered, never lost focus, never gave in, and never gave up. Throughout the pandemic, we have kept all stakeholders well informed of our COVID-19 response and results. Throughout the pandemic, we were pleased that our positivity rate of less than 1% were well below the CDC baseline of 5%, which was an indicator of low rates of infection. The clinical task force met every day, 7 days a week, no less than twice daily, and continues to meet on a regular basis. This task force was responsible for COVID-19 preparations, precautionary measures, mitigations and controls, our response when there was a positive COVID-19 case, our reopening protocols, and our strategies and vaccinations. Perhaps the most notable achievement is a statistic we have yet to share. You are aware that management partnered with CVS to administer vaccines across the ACTS communities. It was a program that the CDC and CMS engaged CVS with a directive to vaccinate employees and residents in skilled nursing facilities. With our endless fight and determination, CVS was authorized to extend that to all of our residents. Incredibly, within 42 days from the first clinic on December 23, 2020, we had 95% of our residents vaccinated with at least 1 dose of the vaccine. That in and of itself was a marathon. We thank all who made this unbelievable achievement possible and all who participated in the vaccination clinics. We have certainly come a long way and truly appreciate the support, cooperation, and partnership of residents and staff. We are so proud of how the ACTS family responded and appreciate the high marks given by the residents in the COVID-19 Pulse Survey. On a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 equals disagree strongly and 5 is agree strongly, all of the company-wide average scores were 4 or better, including a 4.6 for overall response to the pandemic, a 4.7 for keeping residents well informed, and a 4.5 on staff-provided comfort. We learned a lot along the way during the pandemic, and with every storm, there is always a silver lining. Some of the lessons learned, our silver linings, have become best practices we will continue to incorporate into our operations post-pandemic. Some of those are highlighted on the slide and include improved technology through the resident and employee portals. Two of our best practices we developed are the Concierge and Shepherd programs. In these programs, we assign a staff member to assist residents with procuring grocery and meals items to be delivered to their home. With the Shepherd program, the employee assists the resident with the move-in process. Finally, I would like to share the silver lining of having our town halls played virtually, like the one you are watching right now, and our Acts Vision, Our Journey Forward video series hosted by Karen Christiansen and spotlighting Dr. Paul Reinbold, Vice President and Chief Medical Director. We owe a great deal of gratitude to our employees who continue to demonstrate a strong commitment to our mission and support our objective to provide hospitality, engagement, and high-quality services, as well as care to all of our residents. There are a number of ways we seek to recognize our employees for their service to ACTS. The most prestigious employee award we have is the President's Award, which honors employees for exceptional service and commitment to loving kindness. In 2020, these 6 employees were selected for this award. Collectively, these 6 individuals have provided distinguished service of over 75 years to the ACTS organization. Another way we recognize employees is through longevity awards. We know that our employees contribute significantly to our success, so each year we celebrate hundreds of employees that reach benchmark anniversaries. Our culinary and operations team did a wonderful job in making the 2020 celebrations as special and memorable as possible under the circumstances. We recognize 658 employees for 5 years to 40 years of service. Collectively, these employees have provided 7,785 years of service to ACTS. With that type of longevity, we are fortunate to have a low employee turnover rate, much lower than the industry average. Our strategic goal set by the Board of Directors is 15%, but we knew the pandemic would impact our 2020 numbers. Supporting our employees is always important, and 2020 brought unique challenges, as there were national challenges beyond COVID-19, including racial injustice. We have a long history of honoring and embracing diversity with staff from over 40 nations. In addition, our culture of loving kindness sees the inherent good in all. As the world calls for change, we recognize that a greater focus on diversity and inclusion is a targeted way to continue our mission and be sure we are honoring our goals of loving kindness towards all. So we created a diversity and inclusion task force as part of a strategic initiative to identify better ways to embrace and grow our diverse workforce. One important step taken in 2020 in response to our commitment to diversity and inclusion was the renaming of Plantation Estates, being sensitive to how that name is commonly understood and associated. It was a wonderful experience to be part of the selection, celebration, and implementation of the new community name, Matthews Glen. It is now my pleasure to introduce Sue Ahern.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hello, I'm Sue Ahern, Vice President and Controller of ACTS. In the annual report, there is a summary of the 2020 audited financial statements, which I'll review with you. For those of you that enjoy numbers and reading financial statements like I do, a copy of the full audit is available on the ACTS website or from the business office at your community. The financial performance is for ACTS in consolidation. If you think back to the organizational structure slide that Karen reviewed earlier, it includes all of the ACTS entities, including the affiliate organizations. Starting with the balance sheet. We are a large organization as measured by our total assets, which are approaching $2.3 billion at the end of 2020. Although we did not complete any affiliations last year, that doesn't mean we didn't experience growth, as assets increased 5% over the prior year. The largest asset is no surprise, our property and equipment, which represents all of the ACTS campuses. Property and equipment is just under $1.6 billion. With total capital investment exceeding annual depreciation, property and equipment grew by just under 2% compared to 2019. Total liabilities are just over $2.1 billion. There are two primary liabilities: long-term debt and deferred revenue. Debt levels increased in 2020, reflective of two debt financing transactions that were completed during the year, one for the ACTS obligated group and the other for Integrace. Deferred revenue also increased. Deferred revenue represents the entrance fees paid upon residents moving into a community. That entrance fee is recorded as a liability, reflecting the obligation that ACTS has to provide life care services. It is then recognized into revenue over each resident's actuarial life expectancy. An increase in deferred revenue means that the amount of entrance fees coming in during the year outpaced the amount of amortization, which is a favorable trend. On the balance sheet, the difference between total assets and total liabilities is total net assets. ACTS had a healthy net asset balance of $190 million at the end of 2020. In the year of a pandemic, it is truly outstanding that our net asset balance increased almost 8% compared to the prior year, reflective of positive operating earnings. One of the most important aspects of the balance sheet that I didn't mention is our level of cash and reserves. Again, despite the unprecedented challenges of 2020, total cash and reserves increased to $566 million. The majority of the $89 million increase compared to 2019 is within restricted reserves. Restricted reserves include cash that is restricted in use by state regulations, donor stipulations, or debt requirements. The largest increase in restricted reserves was in debt-required reserves, which increased in 2020 as a result of the project fund dollars established as part of the two debt financing transactions. What is most notable is the unrestricted cash and reserves also increased in 2020, reaching just over $360 million. An increase in unrestricted reserves in a year where move-ins were suspended for an entire quarter highlights the effective management of cash outlays throughout 2020. Moving on to the statement of operations, which in the for-profit world is the income statement, the effects of the pandemic becomes more evident. We are so pleased that financial performance was positive, but not surprisingly, it did not keep pace with 2019's performance. Operating revenue is quickly approaching $600 million, ending 2020 at just over $587 million. Despite occupancy decreases in all three levels of care compared to the prior year, revenue increased 2.5%, supported by a monthly fee increase in January 2020. The financial implications of the pandemic were more apparent in the increase in our operating expenses. Most significantly were increased staffing costs related to COVID leave pay for those required to self-isolate for 14 days due to an ACTS exposure, the cost of overtime, agency, and temporary workers to replace those on isolation, and COVID premium pay for those working in a COVID unit. Expenses related to testing, screening, and personal protective equipment were also a challenge in 2020. Net of funds received by government sources, operating expenses grew by 3.7% compared to 2019 and totaled $582 million. Without assistance from the CARES Act and other government funding, operating expenses would have increased approximately 8% compared to 2019. The difference between operating revenue and operating expenses is operating income, which was positive and healthy at $5.3 million. Given all the challenges and uncertainties surrounding the pandemic, this performance is remarkable. We certainly applaud the positive performance, and given the strength of the balance sheet, it is not a concern that operating income in 2020 was below that of 2019. On the financial statements, there are below-the-line items which are considered non-operating activity and are primarily unrealized gains on investments. This gets added to operating income, which provided a $9.8 million increase in net assets without donor restrictions. ACTS received $22.8 million in provider relief funds from the CARES Act. As I mentioned on the previous slide, the majority of the funds we received, $15.4 million, were used to offset extra pay in salary, wages, and benefits. This was followed by $4.4 million to help cover personal protective equipment and cleaning supplies. $2.1 million was used to help fund the additional costs related to agency nursing and other contracted workers. A small amount of the funding was used to offset lost private pay revenue of $566,000, and the remainder of $427,000 offset some of the lost Medicare revenue since elective surgeries were drastically reduced during 2020. Total operating revenue of $587 million is divided into 5 main categories. No surprise that the largest category is resident services revenue, which is 67% of the total and includes monthly fee payments and other resident ancillary fees. Next largest is the amortization of entrance fees at 21%. Third-party revenue includes Medicare Part A and B and a small amount of Medicaid. This is an important source of revenue and makes up 8% of the total. Investment income on our cash and reserves is 2% of the total. And finally, any other revenue, if it doesn't fit into any other category, is called other and makes up the final 2% of the total. Likewise, total operating expenses of $582 million are divided into 5 main categories. Being in the service industry, the majority of the expenses are staffing related. Salary, wages, and benefits and contracted services, which are considered outsourced labor, make up 58% of our total expenses. The other categories are a bit more evenly spread. Depreciation on property and equipment is 15% of the total. Food, supplies, and other is 13%. The fixed costs of insurance, utilities, and real estate taxes are 9%. And finally, the interest that we pay on our long-term debt is 5% of the total operating expenses. When reviewing financial statements, it's important to calculate ratios. We use ratios to measure the relationship between the components of the financial statements and to provide further insight into the financial health of the organization. The ones you see here are considered our key financial indicators. Days cash on hand compares unrestricted cash and reserves to daily cash operating expenses, including interest. It tells us how many days could we continue to pay our expenses if we stopped receiving any more cash. Our days cash on hand was healthy at 271 days in 2020 and improved compared to 2019. Capital structure ratios evaluate how much debt an organization has. One measurement is debt service coverage, which takes all the cash collected in a given year. After satisfying all of our cash expenses, it answers the question of how much do you have left over to cover your debt service payments. Debt service coverage remained healthy in 2020 at 2.4 times coverage, well above our covenant requirements, again, despite not having move-ins during the second quarter of the year. While a decrease compared to 2019, the financial markets and stakeholders are expecting significant decreases in debt service coverage across our industry. So our performance at 2.4 times will be considered strong performance. Debt to assets increased as expected to 40% due to the 2 financing transactions completed during the year. The operating ratio compares cash expenses to cash revenue, so we want our target to be below 100%. If it is below 100%, it means our cash revenue exceeds our cash expenses. We achieved this in 2020 with a ratio of 99.5%. And finally, the operating margin compares operating income to total operating revenue. This helps to put into perspective our operating income of $5.3 million, which equates to just under 1% of our annual operating revenue. We traditionally operate within tight margins, and we were pleased to achieve a positive operating margin in 2020, which was expected to fall below pre-pandemic levels. It was certainly expected that we would not be able to meet the performance of our pre-pandemic financial indicators, as this was realized early in 2020 and shared in the September 2020 Town Hall presentation. We went through the effort of restating the 2020 annual budget. That process was completed in May with the expectation that pandemic activity would begin to improve in the fall and winter months. Unfortunately, That did not occur as we experienced 2 separate waves of increased cases across our nation. Despite that, performance compared well against the revised budget. Specifically, days cash on hand exceeded the revised budget, and debt to assets matched the revised budget. Debt service coverage was very close to the projected 2.5 times coverage. The largest variances were in the operating ratio and operating margin, specifically related to the continued decrease in census in the healthcare centers. As part of the 2020 debt financing transaction for the ACTS obligated group, our credit rating was affirmed in June at an A-. Having a rating affirmed in the middle of a pandemic during a quarter when move-ins had been suspended is another testament to the strength of our reputation and the confidence that others have in our ability to succeed. We are proud to be part of a small group of senior living providers that have an investment-grade rating in the A or BBB category. This provides additional comfort to prospective residents and you, our current residents, that the organization is financially healthy. Each year at this time, we also like to share with you how we are expanding our mission. Few organizations would seek to grow during a pandemic, but that didn't stop us from moving forward with our expansion plans. We completed cottage additions at Normandy Farms Estates and Azalea Trace, with all of them occupied by the end of 2020. We have 4 active presale projects, 2 of which are under construction as we reached or exceeded 75% presales at Lanier Village Estates and Country House. Matthews Glen and Indian River Estates are actively selling their independent living expansions. Our success with the sales activity during 2020 was quite impressive, given the marketing constraints that required mostly virtual sales and events. We also would like to share with you the many ways we collectively support the ministry of ACTS. In total, through the generosity of residents, staff, and other stakeholders, total charitable giving to ACTS exceeded $4.2 million in 2020. Just over $2.2 million was for the family of charitable funds. We also had $1.9 million contributed for special projects and another $143,000 in unrestricted gifts. The most popular fund within the family of charitable funds is the Samaritan Fund, also known as the Heritage and Benevolence Fund at some communities. Receipts during 2020 were $2.2 million, which is net of any liability associated with a charitable gift annuity. This level of contribution exceeded the $1.7 million in monthly fee subsidies during 2020. Thanks to the generosity of others, across the company there were 92 residents whose monthly fee was partially subsidized by this fund. We also collectively serve the greater community, which was highlighted in this year's annual report. The total community benefit of $26 million is an estimated value, which is not reflective of cash payments. Our social accountability contributions come from the donation of our time, resources, and physical space. Thank you so much for helping us make a difference. I'd like to share with you some information specific to the Integrace obligated group, which consists of Bailey Chase, Fairhaven, and Buckingham's Choice. The information I will be sharing is based on the combined results of these 3 communities. Integrace, as an affiliate of ACTS, is a separate legal entity and has its own board of directors. As CEO of ACTS, Jerry Grant serves as chairman. In addition to other members of the ACTS board, 3 residents, Len Hartwig, Jim Ryan, and Ray Van Horn, are full voting members of the board of directors. Independent living occupancy at the close of 2020 stood just over 87%. High unit turnover, which usually averages closer to 10%, exceeded the number of move-ins contributing to the lower occupancy. Occupancy in the healthcare center for Integrace followed a similar pattern to the entire ACTS organization, with occupancy dropping below 2019 levels. This was intentional, as outside admissions of private pay, Medicare, and Medicaid was halted. The average occupancy in Oakbridge Terrace was just under 71%, and Willowbrook Court was just under 60%. Moving to the financial statement review for Integrace, I'll start with the balance sheet. Assets increased to $294 million. Cash and investments increased due to the $33 million project fund established as part of the 2020 debt financing transaction. Like Axe, the largest asset is property and equipment, which was $133.6 million at year-end. It's important to note the increase compared to the prior year. The increase reflects the capital investment in the communities, which outpaced depreciation. Total liabilities were $280.5 million at the end of 2020. There are two primary liabilities: long-term debt and deferred revenue. Debt levels increased due to the establishment of the project fund. Deferred revenue also increased over 2019, which is a favorable trend as entrance fees collected exceeded amortization of existing entrance fees. On the balance sheet, the difference between total assets and total liabilities is total net assets. Integrace has a healthy net asset balance of $13.5 million at the end of 2020. The increase compared to the prior year is related to positive operating earnings. Moving on to the statement of operations, it's hard to tell that Integrace faced a pandemic during 2020. Positive operating income of $800,000 represents a 100% increase compared to 2019. The operating statement includes other non-operating activity below the line. When you include the non-operating activity, we have a minor decrease in net assets without donor restrictions of $700,000. Even with the minor decrease, total net assets still remained very strong and healthy, as we saw on the balance sheet on the prior slide. The key financial indicators support the solid financial performance for Integrace. Days cash on hand increased to 173 days compared to 117 in 2019. Debt service coverage increased to 2.2 times, and debt to assets remained consistent at 34% since principal payments aren't due until 2022. Similar to Axe, the operating ratio changed slightly from 2019 as this indicator shows the impact of the pandemic. The operating ratio was still below 100%, which means that cash revenue exceeded cash expenses. The operating margin improved to 1.4%. Through the efforts of community management, employees, and residents, Integrace had a great year financially despite the pandemic. We're looking forward to occupancy improving in all three levels of living and having another successful year in 2021. It is now my pleasure to turn the presentation back over to Karen.
Thank you, Sue. In summary, 2020 was certainly an unprecedented year. Just as the year will never be forgotten, nor will the strength and stamina of the entire Axe family, who proved that together there is nothing we can't achieve. We came together to protect each other from a novel virus, to develop and implement a phased plan to reopen our communities while preparing for rebounds of the virus. While all aspects of life were altered, we preserved our commitment to high-quality services and our reputation as a leader in the industry. We aggressively pursued vaccinations and quickly reached herd immunity amongst our resident population. Despite having to delay new resident move-ins and increase costs in response to the pandemic, our financial performance was positive and our financial health remained strong. All of this and all of you position our organization for a bright future. We sincerely thank you for choosing Axe and for your continued support, partnership, and prayers. I wish you all continued blessings and good health.